talk, and that's a hard act to follow. You've always been my inspiration when it comes to doing talk, so I hope I can do it justice. But today, when we drive through Camp Butler, what we see is 70 acres of serenity. It's very tranquil, it's very peaceful, it's very uniform, it's orderly, it's immaculate, all those things. But it hasn't always been that way. During the Civil War, and it started in about August 2nd of 1861 through August of 1866, it was a very chaotic, hectic beehive of activity. And that's what I'm here tonight to talk about, is the history of Camp Butler and how it started and its different function and what it is today. So that's the basis of the talk. And when you think about Camp Butler, there were 206,000 men. They were either trainees, military trainees, they were Southern prisoners, or they were men that were in the hospital wards. There were 206,000 men who passed through there during that time. And to put that in perspective, that's 1/5 of a million people in a relatively short period of time. And many people, when you think about the Civil War, you think about Antietam, you think about Gettysburg, Vicksburg, places like that, faraway battlefields. But underneath our nose, right here in Sangamon County, is Camp Butler, and it played a very major role in the Civil War. Just a little bit of background leading up to the necessity of originating Camp Butler, just like we're in a political campaign this year. And there's issues, and I won't get into any of those tonight, but in leading up to the election in November of 1860, slavery, secession was a really hot topic. And that was an issue leading up to the election. Lincoln was elected our 16th president in November of 1860. He was inaugurated on March 4th of 1861. Between the time he was elected and between the time he was inaugurated, 7 states had already seceded. And the South was a culture that was based on agriculture, and it mostly stemmed around the production of cotton, which was a very laborious crop. And the landowners thought it would be cost effective to buy slaves and to enslave them to do the work. Whereas the North, they were industrious and they were into manufacturing, and there were abolitionists that did not agree with the philosophy of slavery. So that was the issue that led up to it. And the South did not see that this was an issue that was going to be resolved. And so they thought it would be in their best interest for states' rights to secede and have their own country. Well, when Lincoln was inaugurated, in his inauguration speech, he extended to them an olive branch. But he also stated very firmly what his stand was, and he was opposed to secession, and he intended to do everything that he legally needed to do to back that up. So that's kind of the background. So 6 short weeks later, after the inauguration, the Confederates bombed Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. And that was the moment that the Civil War started. And so 2 days later, or within the next 2 days, Lincoln and his cabinet and his Secretary of Defense of the War Department was Simon Cameron, and they met and they decided that they were going to call up 75,000 men for 90 days, and they were going to squelch this uprising. That's kind of how they looked at it. They thought it'd be quick, swift, decisive, it'd be over with. Okay? So and during that time, each state was required to meet a quota. And Illinois at that time trained 10 regiments, and they're numbered 7 through 16. And they set up a temporary military training facility. It was called Camp Yates. It was right dab in the middle of Springfield, right in the residential area at that time. And the soldiers were rowdy, and they'd steal, fruit and vegetables and get drunk and roam around the streets and everything. And so anyway, but they were trained and they were deployed to meet that need. And primarily at that time, for those 90 days, their mission was to defend the nation's capital. That was mainly the purpose of the 90 days men. Okay, well, the 90 days were about to run out, and not much had happened during that time, but the Union had decided to charge into Bull Run, Manassas, and they were shockingly defeated, okay? And they had to retreat. So after that, the next 2 days, Lincoln again met with his cabinet, and they decided they were not playing around. They meant business. They were going to get it done, but they knew it would be a long time. It'd be very costly. So they jumped from 75,000 soldiers to 500,000 soldiers for 3 years. Okay? So they then wrote to all the states, and they had determined a quota that each state, and I handed out a map earlier. I have a few extras here if anybody didn't get one. But the president had sent out a letter to all the governors and had indicated what their quota was. And the quotas were based on the state's population at the time, okay? So at that time, our wartime governor was Richard Yates. And he was more than happy to do whatever he could to assist in the mission to preserve the Union. So anyway, so Governor Yates responded to the president and said, yes, I'm behind you, I'll meet the quotas, I'll do whatever it takes. So now this is in July. Manassas' first Bull Run was July 21st. So the president and his cabinet, they decide to send these federal officials out to the different states, and for us it was Brigadier General Sherman. And he came to Springfield, and he met with Governor Yates for the sole purpose of finding a suitable place to have this training facility for the Illinois troops that had been enlisted. Okay, so, and I have pictures here of most of what I'm talking about. Right here is Governor Yates, and he sent out, okay, so Yates was from Jacksonville, so he wasn't real familiar with Springfield and the localities around Springfield, and so he enlisted some of his cronies. That doesn't happen anymore, but it did then. So Yates appointed his friend William Butler, who at the time was the Illinois State Treasurer, and then he also appointed Uzziah Hatch, who at the time was the Illinois Secretary of State. So, and then Yates backed out, so it was the three, Sherman, Butler, and Uzziah Hatch. And they took a carriage ride out to a particular place, and it ended up being an ideal location that Butler, who was a longtime resident of Springfield, knew about, and he had it in mind. And I'm going to just read a little description of Clear Lake. At the time, Clear Lake was a resort, and it was very well known, and a lot of people, it was kind of the forerunner to Lake Springfield. And they had a hotel there, and a lot of people went there and stayed for the weekend or took their vacation there. They had fishing, swimming, boating, all that kind of stuff. So Sherman, Butler, and Uzziah Hatch took a carriage ride 6 miles northeast of Springfield to this location. And it says the land chosen was located between the Sangamon River and Clear Lake, a beautiful body of water fed by springs nearly a mile long and 3/4 mile wide, providing plenty of water for cleanliness and recreation. It was bordered by a forest of large trees, providing a cool, shady place for military instruction and encampment. And it provided firewood. The site had high ground for camping, and to the north extended more level ground suitable for parade grounds for drill and training by infantry or cavalry, as well as space available for a cemetery. It was within easy walking distance from the Sangamon River, which provided a means for cleanliness and recreation. And since Camp Butler intended to serve all of the states south of Chicago, officials felt that the camp should be located closer to a rail line to permit easy movement of men and material. The site not only had excellent roads leading from the capital, but it also offered easy access to the nearby Wabash Railroad, and it was considered to be far enough away from the big city of Springfield to make it easier to prevent rowdiness and violation of discipline. The government immediately took control of the property on which a training camp would be constructed. So originally it was located at Clear Lake Resort. And these right here are all pictures of Clear Lake Resort, okay? One thing I want to interrupt this story for just a minute and give you a little background that Lincoln himself would have been familiar with this area. And the reason I say that is because in the spring of 1831, when Lincoln's family had moved from Indiana to Illinois, they settled over in Decatur near a place that's now known as Lincoln Trails, I believe. And that's where he lived, and he stayed with his parents. His dad and his stepmom and a bunch of other extended family were there too. But he stayed there for a year. But in the spring of 1831, he left Decatur by canoe, came down the Sangamon River, and he disembarked his canoe along with his cousin and a stepbrother. The first place Lincoln ever stepped foot in Sangamon County was by the Sangamon River in what was Jamestown, which is now known as Riverton. And it was very close. Here's a map of the exact location where they would have stopped. And it was very near the location that would eventually become Camp Butler. Okay, so he would have been, and when he got off the canoe, they would have walked the rest of the way into Springfield, and as they say, the rest is history. But he would have been familiar with that. Also, he was a circuit riding lawyer, and he made frequent trips between Springfield and Decatur. He would have had to have gone right through that area to get to Decatur and back. So by Sherman, Butler, and Uzziah Hatch picking that spot for Camp Butler, it's an area that Lincoln would have been familiar with. Okay? Okay, so